Education Director of the Renewable and Sustainable Energy Institute. And he's going to try to manage this group here, and should be fun. Questions, if you have any. We're going to have a Q&A session after our panel debate and discussion. We will have our officers sort of flanking you on either end here with note cards. Just indicate, you can raise your hand. Try not to make too much noise, but we'll spot you. We'll bring you a card, just like in the keynote address. Write down your question, we'll collect them, and have about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A, depending on how things work. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Paul.
Thanks, Patton. I teach graduate students, which means I herd cats all the time, so I'm used to that with the panel. I don't think this is what I do all day. Let me give a bit of background just to sum what we've heard from Amory. Renewables, particularly in the US, are really on a tear. There's been phenomenal growth in both the wind and the solar side. A few facts for you analytical engineering types. In 2012, we built more new wind than anything else. 2013 turned out, look, the data's coming in for 2013. It looks like 2013 was solar's year. We built about 30% of the new electricity capacity that was built in the US was solar in 2013, second only to natural gas. Particularly on the solar side, as many of you know, we've seen dramatic price decreases from about $10 a watt in 2000 to somewhere in the $2 to $5 range now, and occasionally even lower. So it's been an amazing and interesting time, a revolution taking place right in front of us. 2014, you would think it'd be too early to say, but so far it's very promising. In Colorado alone, in 2014, just this year, we've already seen a new 150 megawatt wind farm that Tri-State has been involved with. That's the Carousel farm. And just within the last week, Xcel announced a 100 megawatt solar, a new 100 megawatt solar facility in Colorado. So 2014 is off to an amazing start as well. Now, when you have success, you uncover new challenges. And that's one we're talking about here today. It's particular to solar, and it's kind of a function of the technology. So if you think about wind for a minute, big wind turbines work really well. You put them out in the eastern plains, you have high, strong, steady winds. They work quite well. Those big turbines don't work so well on your rooftop, right? They're just too big, and you probably don't live anywhere that windy. So that technology doesn't scale all that well down to the household level, though our colleagues at NREL are working on that and making some good progress. Solar photovoltaic, it's very different. It's a fascinating technology. The one that drives my calculator, that little solar panel, is pretty much the same technology as you'll find at Xcel's new 100 megawatt solar facility that's now just being built. So solar PV scales down or scales out, depending on how you want to look at it, really nicely. And that leads to this interesting question is, given we're going to build new renewables, given 35 or so states have legislation in place, regulations, requirements that new renewables be built, should we build little renewables at the household level, or should we build big renewables at the utility scale level? So most people in the field will probably agree with everything I said up to now, and from there the discussion goes in all sorts of directions, which is why we have this panel. What's better, bigger, smaller? What's cheaper? What's more environmentally friendly? What's technically preferable? What's politically more popular? What should we do? Should we go in the direction of building so-called utility scale big renewables or distributed rooftop? We've invited some very distinguished panelists with excuse me, very different views on that topic. So the goal here is to help you in the audience understand some of the subtleties and some of the arguments that can help you understand and think about the kind of big versus little renewables topic. Let me briefly introduce our panel, and then I'll throw some questions at them. Excuse me. Starting at your right, that would be, is Leia Guccione, who's a senior associate at Rocky Mountain Institute, which is the organization that Amory founded. Leia is a senior associate with RMI's Electricity and Industrial Practices, where she specializes in microgrids, campus energy systems, distributed generation and storage, and renewable procurement. Prior to joining RMI, Leia served as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer in the United States Navy. She served aboard the USS Pearl Harbor, an amphibious marine transport ship, and the aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan. Immediately to her right is Frank Prager, Vice President, Policy and Strategy, Xcel. The policy and strategy team that Frank heads ensures that Xcel's strategy and policy positions create value for the corporation, its customers, and many stakeholders. Frank's a graduate of the University of Colorado, so clearly a very distinguished academic career. Welcome back, Frank. Where he received degrees in chemical engineering and English. He then earned a law degree from Stanford University. Immediately to Frank's right is Tonyboniface, who's a founder and president of Independent Power Systems, a renewable energy and design installation company he founded in 1996. He expanded the operations of that firm to Boulder in 2006 and then expanded again to Boston in 2010. To date, his firm has installed hundreds of grid-tied solar systems, off-grid solar and wind systems, grid-tied wind systems, solar battery backup systems, all sorts of innovative and smaller systems. Tony, in addition, is a licensed professional engineer and a master electrician. Immediately to his right is Zane Selvans, who's a research director of Clean Energy Action. Zane received his BS in Engineering and Applied Science from Caltech in '98 with a focus on computer science and machine learning. Then moved on and got his PhD in planetary geophysics from University of Colorado in 2009. Since then has refocused his efforts on climate change and long-term sustainability, particularly at Clean Energy Action. He's been working on energy finance and regulatory issues, and particularly on perceptions and distribution of risk. Zane also notes he drinks far too much coffee and doesn't own a car. So, very distinguished panel, probably diverse views on this big versus little renewables question. The way we're going to run this is I have a couple of questions I'm going to throw out to the panel. And we'll start with that and then open it up, as Patton said, to audience questions. So let me pose a first question to the panelists. I'll leave this to anybody who wants to jump in. I'm appointing you Energy King for Colorado. You're in charge. You make the decisions about what the energy situation looks like in Colorado. You don't have to worry about politics or finance or any you don't have to worry about reality. You're the king, and what you says goes. Given we're going to have new solar, given we're going to build new renewables in Colorado, should we build distributed little renewables or big utility renewables? And let me ask a caveat. It's no fair to say yes, both. That's probably true, but that's not a particularly interesting answer. So let me try to pin the panelists down and say, which way should we go? Big or little renewables? Does anybody want to take that one on?
Well, I'll go ahead and start because can you hear this? All right. Now can you hear? All right. As Paul indicated, I'm Frank Prager with Xcel Energy. I am wearing Kevlar underneath this suit jacket, so it's great to be here in Boulder. If I get into any trouble, I am going to start singing the See You Fight song. Just hopefully you all join in. I guess the premise of your question is that if we don't worry about reality, what should we build? Is that basically it? And I'm not sure how to answer that question, so let me just ask a fundamental clarifying question, which is the reality we're not worrying about is we're not worrying about political, we're not worried about economic reality. Are we worried about technical reality? I mean, how electrons actually flow?
Yes, we're worried about real reality. The concept here is what is the best outcome for society, and you're in a position to implement that.
Okay. Well, thinking about it, and I mean, I'm going to go ahead and violate the first rule Paul laid down and say you're going to build both. And the reason you're going to build both is because as Energy King of Colorado, I don't want to force people to pick one way or another. I want to give them options. So the best possible outcome for our customers, who I'm really thinking about here, the people that consume our electricity, is something that provides them with reliable electricity at a reasonable price and that meets the environmental goals that the state has. And Xcel Energy has worked really hard to try to make progress on all three of those fronts. We are right now the nation's #1 wind provider among utilities. We just announced last year and are in the process of acquiring an additional 450 megawatts in Colorado of wind. We have, as Paul indicated, just announced 100 megawatts down in the Pueblo area of solar, central solar, and we also have an additional 70 megawatts that are going to come online later on. The value of all that renewable energy is that it accomplishes all three of the goals that I just laid out. By balancing it through the grid that we have and the grid that supports the reliable electricity that we have on our system, those particular clean energy resources come to our customers in a way that's very reliable. They also have no emissions, obviously, so they help us make progress on the environmental goals the state has. And here in Colorado, we're on track to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions from our company by 35% by 2020 from 2005 levels. But importantly, with those particular projects as well, they actually come in below our avoided cost. Now, that's utility speak for a reality, which is that they actually are saving our customers money without even considering the environmental impacts associated with them. They're lower priced energy sources for us than the energy that we could acquire from natural gas-fired generation, which is our only real alternative now for new energy resources. So they're a remarkable resource for us. That kind of resource depends a lot on government policy. It depends a lot on the great renewable resources we have here in our backyard and the natural background that we have. And it's a very important part of how we try to provide energy to our customers. Now, many of our customers want to have rooftop solar. They want to have distributed solar options. And we think it's important that we allow that to happen and that go forward. We are growing that part of our business dramatically right now. One of the big issues associated with rooftop solar, though, is what is the price? What is the price of it compared to what you do get out of central solar? And the reality is rooftop solar is more expensive. Now, that doesn't mean that rooftop solar isn't a policy choice or isn't an energy source that this state should be pursuing, because it certainly is. If people want it, they should. But the reality is we can get central solar, such as we're building in southern Colorado, for about 6 cents a kilowatt hour, roughly. We estimate that the price of rooftop solar now is about 14 cents a kilowatt hour. That's after federal tax credits, which are such an important part of the viability of this business. In the end, though, the other reason why rooftop solar is so successful right now is other public policies like net metering. And I'm sure we'll talk more about net metering before we're done here. But from our company's perspective, providing customers with choices is very important, and making sure that they have this option is very important. At the same time, we want to make sure that they are not being subsidized to a great degree, at least not unless we've made some clear policy decisions about how that subsidy should work by other customers. The way that net metering works today in Colorado, there's huge subsidies for rooftop solar customers from non-rooftop solar customers. The reality is the grid, the solar energy is enabled by the grid in Colorado. The wires that connect to everyone's house enable solar energy going forward. That means that if customers that are subject to net metering are not paying their share of grid costs, they are receiving a significant incentive from the system and fundamentally from the other customers in Colorado. We're trying to engage in a discussion right now at the Public Utilities Commission here in Colorado about that issue. But in the end, for us to be able to choose between rooftop and central solar depends on making sure we get the right price signals and the right decisions made on public policy to make the best possible choice and provide the most options for all the energy consumers in Colorado.
Maybe I'll jump in. I'm Tonyboniface with Independent Power Systems, and I frankly agree that it needs to be an integrated approach. But I will speak on behalf of a distributed generation, because that's what we do as a company, and I'll speak about the merits of that. And I frankly see it as a transition. I agree that, you know, in an instantaneous basis, rooftop solar may appear more expensive than conventional kilowatt-hour charges by the utility and even large-scale power plants, solar or what have you. However, there is an end to that. I mean, these systems do pay for themselves in time, whether that's 7 years, 10 years, 20 years. That system will be free and clear of its capital costs in that time, after which the system provides free electricity, plain and simple. So it's all about the economic horizon, I think. You know, a solar system costs roughly the price of a car. We all own cars, or most of us do. You know, we can get there from a financial perspective, and there are a lot of innovative ways of getting there. There's leasing, there's owning, there's financing, there's solar gardens, which really caters to a distributed model, or rather more of a power plant model. So, you know, I see it as both. You know, some of the real benefits of a distributed model are I would say the robustness that you can get to the grid. You know, all these inverters that are processing the solar power and synchronizing with the grid are extremely capable machines. They're used primarily for one very simple purpose: crank out the kilowatt hours. If the grid gets unstable, shut down. They're far more capable than that. They can do voltage support. They can do frequency stabilization. They can do power factor correction. And with the addition of a battery bank, they can actually provide independence. Power goes out, you still have power. A lot of these systems can be smart and interconnect, and you could have microgrid communities, neighborhoods, so forth. I mean, all this is, it's future speak just slightly, but the beautiful thing is all the technology is already there. As Amory said, nothing needs to be invented. It's really just a matter of implementation. So, the smart grid is addressing that. There's load management things you can do. There's solar energy that can be produced. There's battery storage that can be delivered to the grid whenever it needs it, whenever it asks for it. So I see it as a harmonious relationship with centralized power, with the grid operators, with distributed generators, investors of these systems. So I know that Paul's trying to stir it up here with, we'll pick one. I guess if I had to pick one, I'd say distributed. But how small is that distributed power plant? And back in the 90s, micro turbines were the thing where everybody, or commercial entities would have a little gas-fired micro turbine in their basement, and it would provide their power. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this, not just solar, but the beauty of solar, again, it's free energy. I mean, let's get down to it. The energy is free. Yes, the gear costs money, the grid costs money, which is an integral part of these systems working, so I don't see it, again, as a competition. The grid is deemed the most sophisticated engineering feat by mankind. It's going to evolve, and I think these distributed systems will be part of that evolution. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, I'll talk. So I think everybody's probably going to say we need some. I think everybody's probably going to say we need some of all of these types, but I'd like to differentiate between. At least I think there's at least 3 different interesting scales of distribution for renewables. I mean, there's the distribution edge, the rooftop kind of behind the meter installation, which I think is what most people think of when we talk about distributed generation. And then there's the other end, the 100 megawatt plus solar plant like the one that Xcel is talking about building now. But there's also a medium ground, kind of megawatt to 10 megawatt scale that's on the distribution system, not on the transmission system. And you can capture a lot of the economies of scale of large installations with that type of installation. But it's a much more distributed system geographically that gives you some of the avoided grid investment costs that the very fine-grained distribution or distributed generation of rooftop customer-sited installations give you. So I think that's an interesting sweet spot. And then there's more types of distribution than just the geographic distribution that you want to think about. There's also the kind of economic distribution, who owns the plant, who gets the returns from the investment in that generation facility. Is it the utility, or is it the homeowner, or can you buy in as a co-op or a city or a rural electric association? And I think again the kind of 1 to 10 megawatt on the distribution system type installation really lends itself to distributed economic buy-in. To build a 100 megawatt plant, you need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, which it's not impossible to do that in a distributed financial model. Solar Mosaic, which some of you may have heard of, has raised, or it's gotten approval to build $100 million worth of basically crowd-funded solar in California. If you look at businesses like Kickstarter or Lending Club, they've both raised more than $1 billion of very, very distributed financing. So it's possible to do billion-dollar distributed financing if you want to. But it's much easier to do modestly scaled distributed financing. And then I think that feeds into a third type of distribution, which is the kind of the political buy-in, which is very important right now. We kind of have a schizophrenic relationship with renewables because the state is so split down the middle politically. And I think providing opportunities for other constituencies to buy in and see the benefit of distributed generation and renewables more generally can potentially break that gridlock in a policy sense. So if the ranchers and the farmers and the people on the eastern plains and in the San Luis Valley and the rural parts of the state, which have historically been conservative, can see, actually selling these renewable electrons to the relatively liberal urban cores is a good alternative revenue stream for us that makes us less dependent on the rain and the beef futures market. then I think we can get to a place where we have much more policy consistency over long periods of time, and that's really, really important. This like whipsaw back and forth with the production tax credits and other policies, it really stymies the industry and keeps us from marching down that cost curve in the way that other places with more consistent long-term policies have done. Yeah, so that's my answer.
Yeah, so I generally agree with everyone here, and I would like to point out, to echo some of the comments that Amory made in his presentation, that in the transformative vision that we see for the U.S. energy future, we do see a role for both centralized and utility scale renewables coupled with distributed scale renewables. In our vision that gets us to 80% renewables by 2050, we see that being 50% utility scale and then 50% distributed side assets. But to the point of the other panelists, and as a microgrid former operator and advocate, there is so much evidence that district energy systems that integrate multiple energy resources at a community level are not only one of the most efficient ways to meet a community's energy needs, they are also one of the most reliable ways to meet a community's energy needs. And increasingly, they are yielding the opportunity to integrate more renewables, and the economics make sense. So combined heat and power systems where one or more users meet their heat needs and their electricity needs with a combined system are beating commercial and industrial retail electricity prices in most of the US today. Not to mention that these systems run at efficiencies over 80%, all right? And they're providing the energy needs at the source where it's needed. Centralized thermal generation plants are generally running around 40% efficiency at their best, and that doesn't even factor in the roughly 30% of energy that is lost in line losses, transferring that energy from central generation units to the actual point of consumption. So looking at the community scale where we can combine multiple resources that meet both heat and electricity needs, capitalizing on the decreasing cost of solar, the decreasing cost of battery storage, gives us an opportunity to create an energy future for our communities that is both more renewable, more reliable, and more economic for everyone. But we need to remember that ensuring and providing a network for these systems to dynamically interact with each other and really capitalize on the risk reduction that comes from a diversity of resources is really key. And that's one of the greatest challenges for the industry right now, is finding the new rules, policies, and technical capabilities that allow these systems to interact with each other, react to environmental changing conditions, economic signals that change is key. And that's really the challenge that's facing the industry as we look at how does the system need to evolve such that these distributed resources can seamlessly provide value with other larger scale resources.
Thanks so much. Several of the panelists mentioned the importance of policy. As we all know, electricity is a heavily regulated industry. Xcel's a regulated monopoly. We have renewable portfolio standards. We have tax credits. Clearly a very large policy presence in the electricity world. One of the policies that's particularly relevant here is the RPS set-aside. For example, as many of you know, in Colorado, Xcel and to some degree the other providers in the state are required to get or put into their mix solar, and a piece of that has to be distributed. My question for the panelists, is that the right policy tool? Did we get that right, or do we need to consider policy change in the state?
So, Paul, I'll go first. I would almost go so far to say as that I don't want to say that the policy is right or wrong, but that we almost don't need the policy. RMI has just come out with some research last week, which some of you might be familiar with, that looks at how the declining costs of solar and battery energy storage are going to create new opportunities for customers, both commercial and residential, to meet their own energy needs without a grid connection in the future. And the reality is that the prices of solar are declining fast enough, and the prices of battery energy storage are further declining fast enough that this is going to be economic for millions of residential customers within the next decade. In certain geographies, we consider that it could be viable for as many as 20% to 50% of all commercial and residential customers to entirely meet their energy needs with solar and battery at equal or lower cost with equal or better reliability to the grid within the next decade. So that's a lot more than the 3% mandate of the state of Colorado.
Yeah, I'd like to add that, I mean, the policy's been great, and it's allowed adoption rates to be very fast. It's driven the cost down. As Paul mentioned earlier, 2010 a watt PV installed in 2000. Now it's saying 250. That's about right. That's pretty low, but it can get there. That was a result of policy. Net metering didn't exist 15 years ago in many states. So I'd say the policy is critical, getting the new technology implemented and launched. I fully agree with Leia, though. I mean, the policy is really, I can't wait till it's done with, because I can't tell you how much we've been whipsawed as a company over policy changes, regulation changes, and so forth. So from a business standpoint, it's painful at best. Probably half of the companies that started in 2007 in solar are gone in Colorado. I would attribute a lot of that to policy changes, frankly. You build a business model based on one program, and next month it changed overnight. So, yeah, so policy is good, policy is bad. I can't wait till the policy goes away. We're there, we're very close. We still need some level of it, but I think with these new financing mechanisms and so forth, as Anne-Marie alluded to, it'll allow us to get there without having to throw down a lot of cash or make big risky investments.
Well, let me just say that from Xcel's perspective, we are, in terms of the macro renewable portfolio standard, we are way ahead of the targets we're supposed to meet, way ahead. And the reason we are is primarily because the price of renewables has dropped so dramatically. And as I mentioned before, we're bringing renewables on now to our customers without regard to a renewable portfolio standard or a carbon price or anything else. We're bringing them on because they're cheap. Now, fundamentally, there is a policy behind that, too, which is there's enormous tax support in the United States for renewable energy. There's 23 cents a kilowatt hour for, 2.3 cents a kilowatt hour for wind, and there's a 30% investment tax credit for solar. When those things start to go away, and one of the whipsaws that certainly we see in the wind industry is the production tax credit's here and then it's gone, then Congress comes back and retroactively reenacts it. And when those things go away, then the price of wind and solar has to continue to drop in order for it to be competitive with other energy resources. That's just an economic reality. One of the big reasons why we've seen such a large adoption in this state of rooftop solar and distributed solar has been a number of different public policies, including the investment tax credit, including some of the incentives that we pay under the Renewable Portfolio Standard for rooftop solar, and including what I mentioned before, which is the net metering incentive, which frankly is the largest incentive of all. Because of that, rooftop solar customers are able to take advantage of the value that the grid gives them in terms of a reliable energy resource without having to break off and go off grid in order to generate their electricity. The grid brings enormous value to them.
I'd like to interject if I could, and that's true, but that money that Xcel's contributing to this comes from you all. It comes from Colorado ratepayers.
Absolutely.
So it's definitely not a gift by any means.
Yeah, and let me just say, I was not attempting to imply that anyone's giving anybody a gift, except for customers without rooftop solar. And remember, there are a lot of customers who can't have solar on their rooftops. There's people who live in apartment buildings. There are people who live in homes that don't have a good solar configuration. Those customers are still paying for the grid. And the share of the grid that is being used by rooftop solar customers who don't pay for any of it when the sun is shining, because they are getting full credit on their bill for the electricity that's being generated. So the other thing that's important to understand is that the value that the grid brings to customers today, maybe in the future, as RMI has indicated, we're going to see continued evolution of battery technology. I think we will. And I think batteries will play a much more important part of the grid in the future, along with distributed generation. But until that happens, the cost today of a customer getting off the grid and going by themselves is, according to the Electric Power Research Institute, is between $250 and $450 a month. Just put that in perspective, our typical residential customer pays about $60 a month in electricity charges. So that's 4 to 8 times the cost of staying on the grid today. Public policy matters because it really allows the customers to be able to afford the kinds of energy resources they're having. Now, I'm going to say where I think public policy needs to go, which is that net metering and other policies have been in place exactly for the reasons that Tony indicated, which is that we had a nascent industry, an industry that was really getting off the ground. We had public reasons why we wanted to have that industry go forward. So we have significant tax credits for it. We have policies like net metering. We have renewable portfolio standards. Now, as that industry evolves, the same paradigms we've had in the past no longer apply. Many of the companies involved in the rooftop solar industry right now are not entrepreneurs like Tony's company is. They are large companies funded by companies like Goldman Sachs and funded by billionaires out of California. They're able to come in and provide services to their customers which are very effective and very, very good for those customers, but that rely entirely on these public policies. As we go forward, we need to think anew about how we approach these public policies. Are we giving the right level of incentives? Are we giving the right level of support to these industries as we go forward? And if we're not, what is the right next step? And that's really where the public policy rule meets the road. That's where we want to take the discussion. What is the correct next step for policy for a changing and a growing and a very successful renewable energy industry that we see right now?
And I'll just add real quickly, about net metering. I was at the discussions in 2005 when post Amendment 37 passing, and there was the solar groups getting together, trying to figure out, working with Xcel Energy and other responsible parties in the program to define, like, well, how do we do this? And I remember clearly that net metering came about because it was simple, cheap, easy to do, meaning you really don't have to do much other than change your meter and it all works. So all these other things that are going to maybe quantify the value of solar differently or so forth is all going to have a cost to it. So and as much as it's important, just a little historical perspective, net metering was designed around simplicity, lack of extra equipment, lack of extra meters, and so forth. And one of the big cost drivers to PV is jumping through all the hoops that we have to go through to get approval by the jurisdiction, to get an agreement by Xcel Energy that things are just so and so forth. So it's something to keep in mind that there's a cost to everything, and net metering was fundamentally designed to be simple and cost effective. And just one thing, Germany, Amory mentioned that now they're studying how Germany's doing solar. Well, Germany does solar cheaper for a lot of reasons. They pretty much pay a fee and they move forward. They have a different electrical system that's not grounded, so there's a lot less copper involved. They trust their installers. They have master electricians who do the work, and they don't get inspected because master electricians do things right. You're tested accordingly and so forth. So Germany's smart because they build an infrastructure of qualified people who know how to do this, and they trust them, and they move forward. So if we're going to get the cost down, we've got to consider that all this policy and metering and jumping through hoops and everything else is probably 25 to 30% of the cost.
Yeah, I agree that net metering, as it exists today, does not scale up well to really high penetrations of distributed generation. But we are so far from that right now. I mean, really, we've got a couple of percent at most distributed solar generation. It's not yet a big cross-subsidy issue. I think we really are still in the very beginnings of that. Although, if we wanted to transition to a much more scalable and durable policy now, that would be great. And I think that the German model, which is basically a standard offer contract, anybody who wants to invest in renewables can do so at the small scale or the large scale. And about half of the distributed generation that they've got is owned by small and medium-sized entities, individuals, farmers, small towns, co-ops, that kind of stuff. but that's not legal in Colorado right now. We need to change the rules to enable that type of scalable policy. And really what we're talking about here is building out, nationwide trillions of dollars worth of infrastructure. And to do that, we need to mobilize a lot of capital. And, policy stability and relatively predictable returns go a long way toward mobilizing that capital at relatively low capital costs. We've seen feed-in tariff type policies, the German model of policy, do that very effectively. You can argue that some kind of reverse auction system might be more effective, and you could implement that in the context of the feed-in tariff if you want to. But I think the risks right now of cross-subsidy are overblown because there are grid benefits, there are avoided distribution system investment cost benefits to distributed generation in the system as we have today with just a couple of percent penetration in the market.
Well, let me if I could, to respond to just one thing here is that if you think about the level we are at today, it is small. We have 18,000 customers today on our solar rewards program, so the level of cross-subsidy today is small. But the issue of Germany has been brought up. That's exactly what we're trying to avoid. Power prices in Germany right now are 35 cents a kilowatt hour. Here in Colorado, they're 11 cents a kilowatt hour. So you're talking about an enormous increase in cost from exactly the kinds of policies that Zane just talked about, which are things like the feed-in tariff or the standard offer. Those are really, really expensive if they're not implemented correctly. And so what we're trying to do with as we approach solar policy is to help define a policy that does two things. Number one is fair to all customers and make sure that those grid costs that are borne by all customers are properly allocated. And second, if there is a need for incentives, that those incentives are completely transparent and we know what they are and we know what we're paying for them. We want to avoid a situation like you see in Europe where you've got the entire energy infrastructure, the electric infrastructure, subject to enormous stress because of poor policy design.
I don't know what exact stress you're talking about. I mean, they have an extremely reliable and much more highly interconnected system than we do. And they have a different kind of cross-subsidy problem in Germany, which is that the feed-in tariff is largely paid for by the residential rate class, and an ever-increasing fraction of the industrial and commercial rate classes have been excluded from paying, into that. But they all benefit from more stable, lower wholesale prices. So there are different ways that these policies can fail, or not operate optimally, and you need to be able to go back and revise them over time. And I'm confident that they will go back and revise that over time. And one other thing, on the pricing thing, we do a horrible job, and Amory touched on this in the keynote, but we do a horrible job of pricing risk into our energy system. Even without the production tax credit and the investment tax credit today, if you did a risk-adjusted comparison of fuel-based electricity and fuel-free electricity, the fuel-free electricity wins hands down because you can lock in a price for a couple of decades, and that's just not something you can do. Even in the futures markets, if you want to lock in a price for 25 years in gas, good luck. Those contracts don't exist. And even going out 10 years, I mean, the liquidity in gas futures is, it's minuscule. There's just no market for it. You can hedge a year, a couple of years maybe, but you can lock in a known price for multiple decades with a power purchase agreement for wind or solar, and we should care about that. That's actually important. The reason that our rates have been increasing recently here is not because of the renewable portfolio standard. It's mostly because of increasing fuel costs and fuel production costs.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add, I mean, Frank mentioned, that customers who don't have solar are subsidizing those who do, as if, having the solar system is the real benefit. But I mean, Amendment 37 was about Colorado voters. 53% of us said, hey, we want an energy mix, and how are we going to get there? And this was the tool to get there. And really, there is risk for anybody investing in a new power plant on the roof with the uncertainty that might be there. Granted, these systems have tremendous warranties and so forth, no moving parts, hyper reliable. But these people had to take the risk. So, that's I see the fairness in the subsidization is, hey, I'm going to throw down my $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 of my cash And yes, you're gonna help me get there, but we all voted this in, so it's a cross-share thing to get things launched, and clearly, we'll get to a place where it's just market-based, and we won't need those subsidies. But
let me ask a kind of a fundamental question here. The sign of a modern economy is in part specialization, right? The clothes I buy at Macy's or, Target or wherever I buy them, the milk I buy at King Soopers, everything is made centrally and provided. And most people would say, well, it makes sense. It doesn't make a lot of sense for me to have a milk cow in my backyard. I should go buy milk at the King Soopers. Most of the products and services we use follow that path. They're made or organized centrally, and they're distributed, and that seems to work pretty well. But the fact that we're having this discussion suggests that electricity might be different, but I'm not really clear as to how. Why, fundamentally, do we have policies that promote distributed generation? What's the reasoning? What's the motivation? Or should we be having those at all?
Well, part of what makes electricity fundamentally different is it is impossible to store electricity as electrical energy. Part of the brilliance of the American power system is that we have a system where electricity is generated in almost the exact same instant that it is consumed, and it has to be that way by the fundamental laws of physics for it to work. Otherwise, we will have brownouts and blackouts, and so you cannot store electricity the way you can store and transport other commodities. And so there's also all these other nuances in our electricity system beyond just the electrons. There's voltage quality and frequency regulation, all these other dynamics that need to exist for electricity to be generated, distributed, and then consumed at so many different points and locations at so many different times. And so the ability that is part of what led to the centralized generation system that we have right now. But distributed generation, as we start to see low-cost energy storage come to the market, is going to fundamentally change, because being able to chemically store that electrical energy and then reconvert it and use it at the same place that it was generated is going to change, is a fundamental challenge that we're going to need to figure out as energy storage technologies come to the grid in much greater quantities in many more places than we've ever seen them before.
And Paul, I'll just, first of all, the work that RMI has done on the issue of storage and the future of storage is really interesting. I think it's great work. And it's very thought-provoking. There's some things in there that some of our engineers scratch their heads over. One of the big issues that we'd be concerned about, what we saw in RMI's work, is the power quality issue. That there are some things that even the study itself recognizes where the power quality is not the same as the grid, which really points to one of the central facts here is this industry, the industry that I work in, is the most capital-intensive industry in the country. And the reason for that is that there is great value in economies of scale in the electric industry. And I think, frankly, that applies to a great degree to solar energy as well. What we see out of these central solar facilities that we are going to be having on our system down in southern Colorado is a remarkable reduction in price from the distributed model. And there's reasons for that. There's good engineering reasons for this. We can put tracking on those things, which is much harder to do on a rooftop. We can orient them so that they are aligned in the sun the way you really want them to be aligned with the sun, rather than based on which way the roof faces. You can use a lot of different technologies to try to promote better solar energy generation, and then the value of being able to deliver that to the customers in a reliable way, balanced with the other energy resources we have on the system, provide both great value in terms of price and also in terms of quality. And those are things that we need to look at. Now, as I said, there are other values here that are important and other things that are important. There are things associated with the way the system runs where there's great value in having generation at a specific location at a specific time in terms of providing voltage support to the system and making sure that the power remains reliable. So renewable energy, in particular solar, can play an important role in that front. There's also value in that our customers really think is important. And I think Tony touched on that, which is important for us too. We want to make sure customers that want to have that independence that comes with having rooftop solar do have that opportunity. But we want to make sure economically that it's paid for appropriately. So when you think about economies of scale, if you're doing it just on a dollars per megawatt hour basis, Paul, you would say without a doubt you want to go with central solar, because that is far, far cheaper than rooftop solar, just because it can be engineered and designed so that it is. When you bring in the other opportunities, when you bring in the other values that are associated with DG, there has to be a role associated with DG going forward, but it has to be defined appropriately and paid for and identified appropriately.
If I may then, so the focus on the price of kilowatt hours is one aspect, but I'd say that the three factors that distributed generation provides to the grid is, grid robustness, I'll talk about them, power quality and empowerment. We've all touched on various aspects of them, but the robustness, I mean, one of the big constraints of centralized power is getting it on, having grid capacity to get it to the markets it needs to get to. Alamos is an example of that. There'd be a lot more of that going on if it didn't require billion-dollar transmission lines to get the power out of these remote deserts to the population centers. Distributed generation doesn't have that problem. You also get, as Leia mentioned, the 30% loss in getting a kilowatt hour or a kilowatt from the power plant to the home. So there's already a 20-30% premium on the value of local produced electricity. With the advent of batteries, and let's face it, they're here. I mean, your electric car has one. So as soon as that electric car can back up your house, we're there. And I'm sort of surprised it hasn't already happened. And I know this company's working on bidirectional chargers for cars. So I think we're there. Imagine that in grid stability, one of the big problems, especially in the mountains at the end of the line, is your voltage, your power quality. You're subject to the power line more than anybody, because when the ice storm happens, the tree falls, the grid goes down, you at the end of the line, you're going to suffer first and foremost. So batteries can help with that. Local generation can help with that. So that's just one example. Power quality, these inverters aren't just kilowatt hour producers, they're also power factor correctors. Technical term just to say that one of the issues that any electrical distribution system has, any consumer of electricity is power factor. It just has to do with the relationship between the voltage and the current. These inverters can correct that if they're allowed to do it. Right now, there's very strict rules, understandably, from the utility as to what these inverters can and cannot do, safety being paramount, and that's perfectly understandable. UL 1741 is the standard by which all inverters are produced, and the fundamental goal of those things is to not backfeed the grid for obvious reasons. We don't want to be electrocuting people working on the lines and so forth. But these inverters can do much more. The grid can work with them, and that's where I see this the power quality coming around. It's already being used on island systems and in commercial institutions where these solar systems, massive solar systems, are actually doing more than kilowatt hours. They're actually providing stability to the grid. Empowerment. You now have a choice. You can get electrons from your roof. You can put them in a battery. You can back up your home when the power goes out. I'll just say one of the most remarkable things I saw during Hurricane Sandy was a bunch of guys in their three-piece suits kneeling down on a curb, charging their cell phones off of a battery. It was a remarkable image, and here we are in the most important city in the world, and as soon as that grid goes down, we are back to the Stone Ages. So I think distributed generation provides incredible robustness to our individual freedoms and to the grid itself.
Thanks, Tony. We've got a number of very interesting questions from the audience. I would say 75% of them are pointed barbs at Xcel, so that's just the nature of the politics in Boulder. But I will screen out those that are a little more vociferous. And in any case, Frank, you will not be surprised. That was a question for you. How worried is how is Xcel for preparing for the potential for ratepayers to move to distributed generation, thereby narrowing the customer base and causing rates to have to increase because they're spread over a fewer number of customers, thereby encouraging more customers to move to distributed generation, et cetera? That's called the concept is the utility death spiral. Frank, how is your company preparing for that, if at all?
Well, death spiral is such a pejorative name. We are, as a company, our strategy is to try to make sure that we're meeting the customer's needs the best way we can. Now, you know, I understand there's lots of barbs in your packet of questions, and as I indicated earlier, I fully expected that. Our goal, though, is to try to work with customers and provide them with value. We think if we do that, we won't be in any death spirals. One of the things that we are looking at right now is some of the very issues that we've talked about today, and trying to think through how can we provide customers with more value given the changes that we see on the system. So let's take the issue of storage, for example. My personal opinion is that storage on the system together with distributed generation works best in conjunction with the utility grid, and that the utility grid makes that possible and makes it effective. As is true with almost any business, and certainly true with ours, if we can provide our customers with value through designing a grid that enables them to make use of the storage and distributed generation options that are going to happen as the technology moves forward, I believe we'll be very successful. And I think that we will find new lines of business for our company to be in that will be complementary to the kinds of things we're seeing out there right now. In fact, that's the vision that we have for the future of the company. At some point, we're going to continue to get cleaner. We're going to continue to get more flexible, and we're going to continue to get more responsive to what our customers need. That's what's going to make us a very successful business. Along the way, we got to get the rules right so that we can keep our prices down and keep our prices in a range that will work for all of our customers. But that's our long-term goal, and that's how we'd like to see our company evolve in response to that very threat that the question mentions.
Thanks, Frank. A somewhat related question for any of the panelists. What policies would allow utilities to embrace rather than resist distributed solar? For example, cost recovery for lost revenue, utility ownership of distributed systems, and so on.
Well, I know that when this comes up, everyone talks about there needs to be third-party independent studies, and I think that is what has to happen. Otherwise, it's going to be a pissing match. But clearly, that's what needs to be done, is what is the value of the solar energy when it is being pushed onto the grid? And is it a net benefit or is it a net cost? And if it's a benefit, to what value? So until that third-party study happens, I think it's just going to be just that, a pissing match.
I think also, if you really want to scale up distributed generation and aggressive investment in efficiency kind of across the economy, we have to find some way to accelerate the retirement of existing fossil fuel generation resources. We will eventually be limited. We are with flat demand right now, limited on the grid by how much space there is to add new fuel-free generation. So we have to find a way that everybody can agree to get the coal out of the way. And right now, I don't think there's a robust conversation about how to do that.
I absolutely agree to Tony's point, is that, the utility industry evolved under sort of a regulatory structure that really only allowed them to provide one product in one way. And this rigidness makes it nearly impossible for utilities to try and provide, the distributed generation bundled with energy efficiency. I mean, utilities have been doing great things with energy efficiency programs in the US, and they don't get nearly enough credit for how well they're doing this in most places. But the regulatory process and then the current regulatory model really only allows them to provide one service in one way. And with changing values and expanding technologies, what we're finding is that there are a lot of new things that people value and a lot of new ways to provide those services. And the regulatory environment needs to evolve in order to allow utilities to compete in providing those new services in new ways.
Thanks. Another question on a topic that hasn't come up yet is the security issue. Security of centralized versus distributed. Are the benefits that the U.S. military has recognized important enough to tip the balance to distributed generation and microgrids? I'll ask Leia to start because I know she's worked in this field.
Sure, absolutely. So, let's start with the facts. Is the military is still wrestling with this just as much as anyone else. And while the military is wholly embracing microgrids in their facilities in the United States because they see a reliability benefit and they're thinking about their need to be able to dynamically respond and continue to execute missions in the event of national disturbances, terror attacks, severe weather events, et cetera. They're still struggling with the same issues that other commercial and industrial customers and communities are struggling with in terms of how can I do this? You know, military has facilities all over the United States. They're in deregulated territories, they're in regulated territories. In some cases, they have a trained workforce that knows how to actually operate these systems and improve their reliability, and in other places they don't. But there is absolutely a reliability benefit to distributed resources. If you look at data centers across the US, which are arguably, and you know, Frank, tell me if I'm wrong, the largest customers on the grid with the highest reliability need. They need, you know, 5 nines or more of reliability. When people build data centers, they build them with their own on-site generation because they do not trust the grid. It's not reliable enough for them. And so it's a real point to the security advantages of distributed generation. You know, it's, when you think about it, one of my favorite phrases from Amory is, if you're a terrorist, would you rather see the Three Gorges Dam or 3,000 microgrids? Enough said.
Thanks, Leia. Any other panelists want to say something briefly about security?
Well, you know, we spend a lot of time on security, cybersecurity, physical security. There is a lot of regulation that we are subject to on security, and we do a lot of it ourselves. Distributed generation has advantages for security, but again, all those advantages come at a price. And so just like any of the security initiatives that we pursue come at a price. The big thing that's going to happen over time as we see the grid evolve is we're going to have to see a balance put in place such that we can take advantage of the tremendous power that the grid gives us, the tremendous economic and flexibility power that an integrated grid gives us, and be able to take advantage of that at the same time we're improving the security and the hardness of the grid. And so there will be a role for, again, you know, this is a lot of, as Tony said, future speak, but there will be a role for microgrids. There will be a role for distributed generation in just this paradigm, in the paradigm of security, in order to make sure that the grid can withstand the kinds of attacks that might be imposed on us. But, you know, the other piece to this is that the grid itself is a secure measure, because if you take one piece down, the grid is able to work around that piece and be able to provide reliability back to the customers that need it. So we are constantly thinking about that, and DG will play a role in that process going forward.
And I'll just say, I know there's a New York Times article talking about this, and they said the Department of Defense said it's not a matter of if, but when the grid will get hacked. So I know Iran and China are actively hacking multiple infrastructural components in the U.S., so they know what's going on, and you know, you got to ask yourself, you know, if the grid gets hacked, are you prepared?
Well, further, I'd like to say, it's not when it's going to get attacked. It has been attacked. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the attack that happened on PG&E's Metcalfe substation in San Francisco. Okay, everyone should go and look this up when you leave here. John Wellinghoff is on a personal mission, literally like a campaign across the US, to elevate to the electricity industry the severity of what happened. There was a targeted, highly trained, sophisticated attack on the substations at Metcalfe Station that nearly took out the entire Silicon Valley for 9 months or more. And it happened about 8 months ago. I forget exactly what day it was, okay? The grid has been attacked, and we really have to think about our vulnerabilities and how a dynamic, interconnected network that allows distributed and centralized resources to work together can make it stronger for us.
Thanks. Let me pose one final question to the panelists. We've got a number of students and smart researchers here in the audience. We're at a university. We work hard to solve problems. Give us your problems. What's your wish list? What's specific? What would you like to see, whether it's a policy or a technology or an approach or a study that could move us forward in making optimal use of distributed generation in the U.S.?
Well, I'll just jump in, and I think it's been a problem it's been the issue all along, and that is getting the smart grid to work. I mean, I know 4 years ago, I saw linemen outside my place, and I went out and said, what are you guys doing? They said, oh, we're wiring up the smart grid, and there's, I think Boulder's pretty well wired for smart grid. So now I'm wondering, like, well, what's the next step? And I don't know if it's a utility issue. I don't know what it is, but anyway, I see just the next, integrating this market. Let's get it going.
I'd say work on developing business models that don't require regulatory approval and that work behind the meter. I like to think of it as a kind of behind the meter insurgency, and a lot of these issues can be forced if we work to kind of cannibalize demand for the existing generation, much of which we would like to take offline. And there are profitable energy efficiency investments to be made, many billions of dollars worth. You just need to find a way to provide those services in an easy to consume package. And I think there are a lot of very profitable businesses out there to be built that don't require, going to sit in front of the PUC or, bicker with the state legislatures.
From our perspective, I think there's the company would probably be very interested in some of the developments in terms of bringing down the price of renewable energy, because renewable energy is enormously valuable to us and to our customers. We need to be able to have renewable energy exist, whether it's central scale or distributed scale. It needs to exist in a policy atmosphere that doesn't require subsidies, that is clear and transparent, and yet can still compete with all of the other energy resources that are out there. Because there is enormous value in terms of what our customers are interested in. There's enormous value in terms of future regulatory risk. And for a lot of the reasons we've talked about here, there's enormous value over the long term for the utility system and for the company. I would like to see us continue to evolve renewable energy and continue to see that price come down such that it can compete without these significant public policies going in place.
I'd like us to see greater transparency and eventually uniformity in interconnection processes, but both across Colorado and across the United States. We work with a lot of organizations that are exploring microgrids, they're exploring solar battery hybrids. And for larger scale customers, these are incredibly cumbersome, customized interconnection agreements, and there is very little transparency or uniformity about what you can do in one place and what you can do in another. And to the extent that we can enable with software modeling systems the tools for utilities to do this more quickly, and for us to share that information so that it becomes clear what should be allowed, so that we can equitably and quickly get more distributed resources out there, I think that would be a great thing.
Yeah. Thanks so much, panelists. Our time is out. We need to move on. Thanks so much, particularly the audience, for paying attention.